For context, I'm a girl, and the major part of this story happened when I was in 8th grade. I lived in the same house from the age of 4 until I was 21. It was a duplex, meaning there were 2 houses on the same property, with a large backyard. Our property manager had turned part of his garage into a small bedroom and had rented it out to a man. My family moved into the home closest to the backyard when I was 4. My dad, being the friendly guy he is, made friends with the man living in the small bedroom across from our home. This man was older, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, always reeked of alcohol and cigarettes, wore glasses, and had crooked teeth, the works. Over the years, he'd watch me closely, in a creepy way. He'd only leave his door cracked open about an inch, and I would see his glasses gleam as he watched me play with friends or by myself. He would always try to tempt me to come to him with money or candy. As I got older, I started inviting my middle school friends to my home. A few of them would comment on the weird man staring at us. I remember a time where I said, "He's staring at us again," and one of my guy friends responded with, "He's not staring at us, he's watching you." My best friend, we'll call her Karen, and I had been super invested in Naruto. We'd always watch it on our spare time together. One of the characters, Jiraiya, was a super pervert who would lurk around women. Naruto called him Pervy Sage, so we started calling the creepy old man Pervy Sage as well. Late one evening around 8 or 9 p.m, when I was about 13 or 14, Karen and I were in my dining room area, sitting at the computer with my dog on my lap. My parents were at work. My older brothers were in their room. They shared the master bedroom. They were hanging out with their friends. I recall hearing my front door open, but not thinking much of it. That's until I smelled the stench of cigarettes and alcohol. We looked to our left and saw him inside my home, but neither of us said anything. Karen and I were both in shock. He walked up to us and stood behind me. He began to play with my hair, asking what we were doing. Karen and I just sat there, not knowing what to say. He knew my parents weren't home. She blurted out that we were ordering pizza online and typed in Pizza Hut on the search bar. She later told me if we ordered pizza, a grown-up would come and we could tell him or her what was wrong. The man did not budge. He continued to play with my hair. Karen got up and nervously said, "I'm going to ask your brothers if they want anything on their pizza." And with that, she ran to her right, straight down the hallway, and bolted through my brother's door. I had just finished the pizza purchase and heard her scream, "Pervy Sage is acting weird." The man spoke only Spanish. I doubt he knew what she said. But with that, I grabbed my dog and ran towards my brother's room and repeated it. "Pervy Sage is acting weird." Both Karen and I were blurting out how weird he was being, and how he came in uninvited. I can imagine we both looked hysterical. My brothers told us to get the hell out of their room. I'm not sure if they were trying to look cool in front of their friends, but I knew how they were. If I didn't do as they asked, I'd get beaten up or told off. Karen and I looked at each other, sort of defeated. We closed their bedroom door and stood in front of it for a second. We looked back at where we originally sat, but the man was not there. Karen and I ran to the kitchen, grabbed 2 knives, and ran into my bedroom and locked the door. She sat on the bed with my dog, and I sat on the floor, trying to listen or feel if he was walking around my house. My house was old. It would easily shake when someone walked around, so I felt if I sat on the floor, I'd feel if he were inside. My bedroom had 2 doors, one with a lock that connected to the hallway, the other with no lock, connected to my parents' room, which was right next to the front door of the house. Karen and I heard footsteps in the living room once more, then silence. We both looked at each other in horror. We both rushed to the second door and pushed against it, just in time to stop him from opening it. The man pushed for about 30 seconds before stopping. The moment he stopped, Karen and I took the opportunity to push a dresser into the door to barricade it. About 15 minutes of us sitting on my bed, knives in hand, we heard the pizza guy arrive. With that, the man was gone, back in his hole of a bedroom outside my home. We locked the front door and ate our pizza. We didn't call the police because of where we lived. We thought, who'd believe 2 kids? A few days later, Karen and I reported everything to our school counselor. She was an amazing, caring woman. She was always there for us no matter what we needed, so we trusted her enough to tell her what had happened. She made a full report and interviewed us both separately to make sure we weren't lying. She called us both into her office the next day and let us know that she had called the police to report the incident, but they told her we cannot do anything until something happens. Karen was furious. Are we supposed to be found dead in a ditch for them to do something? I can still hear her saying this to this day. Our counselor called our parents to report the incident. Karen's parents didn't seem to care. Their divorce was more important. My dad asked me if it was true and said he'll talk to the guy. My brothers came to me saying, if he comes near you, tell us. All of a sudden they cared. My dad remained friends with the man. The man stopped talking to me for years, but never stopped watching. When I was 16, Karen and I were hanging out near the front of the property. The man had ridden his bike near us and said, "Your attitude has changed," in Spanish. This was the first time he said anything to me since the event 2 to 3 years prior. So I told him, "I'm not a kid anymore. I know what you are, and I can fight back." Karen glared at him. He moved away shortly after that. Karen and I lost touch after he moved away. We both went to different high schools, and for the first 2 years, we tried our hardest to remain in contact, but we grew apart. That, and her mum had her moving from place to place after the divorce. I grew up with trust issues around men due to that guy, just something I'm slowly trying to get over. I'm 24 now. The last time I saw him was in my dad's car, as he was riding his bike down the street, but that was back when I was about 18. I haven't seen him since. When I was 25, I was living in a small town in West Virginia and finally moving into my own place without roommates. The place was a bit run down, but the landlord promised a new stove, and I was very much persuaded by the idea of living alone for the first time. At some point in the process, I remember my landlord telling me to avoid the guy who lived next to me in the building, which, as a single woman, is not really something I wanted to hear, but managed to shrug it off in a fit of optimism. One night, after I had moved in, it was about 9 at night and dark outside. I was hanging out in the living room, listening to music and surfing the internet, when there was a knock on the door. I borrowed my very nice and normal downstairs neighbor's snow shovel, broke it, and left him a note saying the hardware store was out, so I was expecting we'd talk about it at some point. I figured the knock was him and opened the door, initially friendly, but then increasingly confused as I took in the figure before me. It was dark, and I wasn't used to having a porch light to think to turn it on, so it took me a little bit to realize that this may not be my nice neighbor. The guy in front of me held a can of beer in one hand and was swaying unsteadily on his feet. Alarm bells went off. "Hey, I was wondering if I could stop in for a bit," he said, as he looked past me with open curiosity and unabashedly scoped the interior of my apartment. I was creeped out and wanted him to go away at the soonest possible moment, but I had the feeling that I had to be careful because he was drunk, and I feared that he might be the type to react explosively. So I politely declined and tried to stay friendly, which fortunately worked, and he stumbled affably back to his apartment. Once I got the door closed and locked, I sat there, all weirded out. I noticed that my front door had 3 small windows, which I promptly covered. He kept weird hours due to work at Walmart, so we managed to not have much to do with one another, and life was pretty alright for a while. One lovely spring afternoon, I got home from work, and just after I pulled into a parking spot and killed the engine, my jaw dropped. I hadn't rolled up my windows yet, and in the silence when the engine stopped, I heard something. No, that can't be what I think it. Oh my god, it is. My neighbor had all of his windows and his door open, presumably to let in the fresh spring breeze, and at abnormally loud volume, I hear the unmistakable sounds of porn, all the years and moans and groans. My brain was not prepared to deal with this situation, and I had to take a moment to assess. The sticking point was that I was going to have to pass by his door to get to mine, but this was wide open, and somewhere behind the screen in the dark living room, there were presumably things going on in there that I really did not want to see, hear, or be involved in. And who the hell watches porn with their front door open? After that, the porn at ridiculous volume became a regular feature of life there, at all times of day and night. It's one thing to overhear your neighbor's porn or sex unintentionally, but this felt really intentional, and it felt like he was imposing on me in some way. Very uncomfortable. It got to the point where I couldn't take any more. I mean, I honestly have no idea how or why the other neighbors never said anything. The volume was beyond just loud. It was blaring. And there were kids that ran around our yard and cul-de-sac. One afternoon, it was again obnoxiously loud and seemed to go on forever, so I called the police. I thought, if nothing else, that it was pretty indecent or inappropriate, considering the area is trafficked by kids. Also, with my landlord's warning and subsequent observations of him being a giant sketchball, I was not about to confront him myself. When the officer arrived, I went into my bedroom where there was an open window near the stairs to eavesdrop. The officer greeted him by name, which means he knew him, slightly worrisome on its own, and asked him how his job at Walmart was going. He continued on to say that there were complaints about the loudness of the videos he was watching, and to turn it down. My neighbor got it, acted compliantly with the officer, who left without incident. That was, fortunately, the end of the blaring porn, but he was always the creep next door. Our bedrooms abutted, and sound carried, so I always had a gross feeling that he could probably hear me having sex, and maybe, enjoying it. This is not something that happened to me, but to some very good friends of my husband's family. This was almost 10 years ago, and the family now jokes about it as if it were nothing, but I could not imagine going through this. My husband's mum is a very good friend with a woman, Jennifer, and he was best friends with her 2 sons, Kenny and Ryan. When they were teenagers, at the time of the story, Jennifer had recently divorced the boy's dad and moved into a house in a neighborhood where they didn't know anybody. Kenny was 18 and Ryan was 15. They both were very into music and various instruments. Ryan has a drum set that ended up causing trouble in basically every place they lived, this house being no exception. Ryan always made sure not to break noise ordinances, but neighbors in quiet neighborhoods don't take kindly to any disruption at any time of day, so Jennifer had to put up with quite a few complaints. She didn't really mind. She always told her neighbors her son had every right to practice his drums and they could shove it. Usually that worked well, but one time it didn't. The man who lived immediately beside them was a nice enough guy, middle-aged and lived alone. He worked as an exterminator. He even offered to do some free sprays around the property for them whenever he did his own house when they moved in. But, like most people, he didn't like to hear drumming every day. I don't know his name, let's call him Tom. So it started off pretty normal. Tom would come over when he thought it was getting a little late for Ryan to be drumming, and Jennifer usually was pretty nice about it and said she'd make sure he stopped by 10, which was the local noise ordinance cutoff in residential areas. But eventually, she got really sick of his visits, as they started to happen every single time Ryan started playing his drums, even in the middle of the day. If this guy was home, he'd come over to complain. Kenny started answering the door instead, and basically telling the guy to screw off and stop coming over. This only seemed to make him more persistent. Tom started calling multiple times a day. I'm not sure how he got their number. Sometimes in the middle of the night, to scream at Jennifer about her boys being stupid a-holes, and how she was dumb who couldn't keep a man around who could teach these boys a lesson. Jennifer ignored the calls and him coming over for a while, until eventually Kenny threatened to call the police if he didn't stop harassing them. The guy backed off and everything seemed fine for a long time. They were finally starting to make friends in the neighborhood and really settle in. One day, Jennifer was out with my mother-in-law while Ryan and Kenny went to a local baseball field to play with some friends. They got home just before Jennifer and realized the front door was slightly open. Figuring one of them had been a doofus and forgotten to close it when they left, they just strolled inside. Kenny walked through the front hall to the living room, where he had a good view of the kitchen. In the kitchen, he saw a man in a full exterminator suit and gas mask, spraying something around the room. About this time, Ryan called him from the other side of the house, asking if Kenny could smell something weird. This alerted Tom that people were in the house again, turned around, saw Kenny standing there, still holding a baseball bat, and darted out the back door in the kitchen. Kenny chased him, but Tom got back into his house and locked the doors before Kenny could get him. Kenny went home, got Ryan out of the house and called the police, but when they questioned Tom, he, of course, denied everything, and as there were no witnesses, they had to let him go. Jennifer got the house tested for toxins while her and her boys stayed in a hotel, and the results came back with deadly amounts of pest poison in every inch of the house. It was bad enough that her renter's insurance had to pay out to replace every bit of furniture, clothing, and anything else porous they owned. It terrifies me thinking of what would have happened had they not caught the guy and stayed in that house, and the fact that this psycho is still out there with access to multiple toxic substances. Last year, I moved out of my parents' place to start university in a different town. I moved into a high-rise building apartment with a roommate who was also a young female student at my school. This was my first real experience living on my own and in a different city from my parents, so I was very much excited about feeling like I was becoming an adult. My building was newly built and had 24-hour concierge on duty service, so I never felt unsafe. About a month after moving in, I came across the man who lived in the apartment next to mine. We'll call him Jack. I mainly noticed Jack because he had an adorable bulldog named Python. As a huge lover of dogs, I couldn't resist introducing myself so I could pet the pupper. This is when we got to talking about how we were neighbors, how we liked the building, a general introduction type of conversation. He was very polite and friendly, not overly so, but genuinely seemed like a nice guy. so we exchanged numbers so that I could walk his dog for him if he ever needed. Jack was easily 15 years older than me, but never gave any indication of being creepy or inappropriate. Occasionally, I would be out smoking on my balcony, which was connected to his, separated by a frosted glass panel, when he would come outside and smoke as well. The way the balconies were, we would lean over and have a conversation. Usually it was nothing more than a "how was your day" type of conversation. Although one time, he overshared quite a bit about how he used to be pretty heavily addicted to coke when he was closer to my age. Not the weirdest thing, and I'm not one to judge, but I definitely didn't want to get to know him better. I was still pretty much indifferent towards him. After a few months of living there, I didn't hear from him or run into him at all anymore. Around Christmas, I went on a week-long vacation with my best friend. While I was there, I had my data turned off to avoid roaming, and you had to pay to connect to the Wi-Fi by the hour, so I was mostly disconnected. One day, I bought an hour of Wi-Fi and received a series of odd iMessages from an unknown number. They were incomplete messages, essentially word vomit in text form. The messages ranged from things like, "Are you outside my window? I think I can see you," to, "I know I'm fat, you were right." I had no idea who would be sending me something like that, so I responded with, "Who is this? Sorry, I got a new phone," and all I got back was, "lol." I kind of brushed it off for whatever reason. I assumed it was a mixed up number or a bad joke or something, and totally forgot about it. Fast forward a few months to the spring. One day I was at the gym with two of my guy friends. As we turned the corner, I run into Jack. My friends go off to continue their workout, and I hung back to catch up with him, but the whole time he was talking to me, I had this feeling of just wanting the conversation to be over. He had mentioned he had gotten rid of his dog a few months prior because he was unable to care for him anymore. I didn't pry. After leaving the gym, my friends and I went back to my place to get ready to go out to the club for one of our friends' birthdays. I was dressed up in a skirt and heels with my hair and makeup done, which I normally do. We left the apartment, and when the elevator came up, Jack was inside, on his way home, I guess just returning from the gym. He said hey, and went to his apartment. About an hour later, I was at a friend's for the pre-party when I got a text from an unknown number. "Hey, you looked really good tonight," winking face. "Let me know if you want to come over sometime." I knew immediately that it was Jack, and this is when I remembered giving him my number at the start of the year. I noticed there were more texts earlier in the conversation, and when I scrolled up, I realized it had been him sending me those weird messages when I was on vacation. All of a sudden, I was starting to piece together that he was certainly a little off, and I didn't like the vibes I was getting at all. I ignored the messages and blocked his number and figured I would do my best just to avoid him from here on out. A month passed by where I didn't see or hear from him again, until one morning when there was a knock on my front door. Not unusual, as I have a few friends in the building who might drop by from time to time, but still checked the peephole first and saw it was Jack. I decided not to open the door and just said loudly enough for him to hear, "Hey?" He responds, "Are you gonna come out and talk about it? If not, I'm calling the police." I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about, and I thought it had to be a joke. What he said next, and the cold, serious tone in his voice, really drove home how real this was. "I know you've been watching me." At this point, there was absolutely no way I was opening the door. I watched through the peephole as he pulled out his phone. He called someone, and based on the initial words, I could tell it wasn't the police. He was hysterical, trying to explain to whoever was on the other end that I wouldn't let him in. I learned later that it was his brother on the other end, because his brother called the building management to let them know what was going on. who then called the paramedics. When the paramedics got there, they brought up a stretcher and sat him down to take his blood pressure and try to calm him down. The whole time he was frantically trying to explain to them that I had been spying on him for months, that I had drilled holes in the concrete wall between our apartments to install cameras to watch him. He refused to leave until he could see the inside of my apartment, because he was so convinced that his co-workers were all part of this and were hiding out in my place watching the whole thing unfold. It was honestly really hard to watch. It was clear now that he was having some sort of mental break, but he kept yelling that he didn't want to hurt anyone. He just wanted us to believe him. Eventually, he was handcuffed and taken away because he refused to leave the hallway in front of my apartment. This whole ordeal took place for around 4 hours, and I was ordered to stay inside the entire time. When the paramedics were checking him out, he was showing them photos he had taken of cameras set up in his apartment. But the paramedics kept responding, "Sir, I'm looking at the pictures, but there is no camera there, I promise you." I was really shaken up afterwards. The management let me know that he was placed on an involuntary hold at a psychiatric facility, but that was all I knew. I didn't hear anything else for weeks, until one day, as I was leaving my apartment, I guess Jack heard me, so he came out of his apartment. He began apologizing and tried to explain that he had relapsed on drugs. I didn't really want to start a conversation about it, because as much as I felt sorry and wanted this guy to get the help and support he needed, he had already made me extremely uncomfortable. Jack must have moved out soon after, because a few months ago, I met 2 women who had moved into his place. He was a troubled guy, going through a pretty rough experience. Still, I can't help but feel a little uneasy about the whole thing. What if I had gone over to his place? What if I had opened the door? I really sincerely hope that he gets the help and support he needs. But for now, Jack, let's not meet again. This happened in my second year of uni. 3 friends and I rented a house together for a year. Only problem was, my friends had taken so long deciding on living together that the only places left were on the rougher half of an already rough town. Things seemed to go great for the first couple of months. I even met someone I really liked, and she would spend most weekends at my place. Our only problem was the neighbor. We'd never see him really, but occasionally we'd spot him diving behind his curtains when we walked past his window. A couple of times I'd spotted his beady eyes from the darkness of his house. Apparently, the dude didn't like our stairs, which granted were old and creaked way too much, and would occasionally bang on our shared walls after someone had used the stairs. We just ignored it. Wasn't like we could do anything about the stairs after all. So then one day about 5 or 6 a.m, he scaled the brick wall into our backyard and started slamming on our back door. Thank God we kept it locked. When we tried approaching the nearby window to see what the hell was happening, the dude bolted back over the wall and into his house. A minute or so later, he's at our front door, bashing at it over and over. Sounded like someone was trying to kick in the door. One of my housemates decides to try and reason with the guy through the safety of the letterbox, asking him why he's bashing on our house and if he'd please stop. I had decided to fish the hammer out of my toolbox in case the guy broke through the door so I could dome him. Anyway, the dude starts screaming about how we woke him up during the night, so now he was going to make us suffer, and said he was going to kill us as soon as he got through the door. Housemate number 2 decided that calling the cops was the most reasonable choice, and did just that. The cops decided to send a couple of PCSOs, i.e. pretend cops, to deal with the situation. They did everything they could, however, everything consisted of them talking to us, and then talking to him and asking him nicely to, quote, get along with us before leaving. After that, he upgraded his creepy watching us while we walked past his house routine, so that it also involved incessantly chanting insults and threats at us as we walked by. Nice guy. There was another incident with the creepy guy bashing on our door and threatening us in the dead of night, and this was when my new girlfriend was there. We called the cops again, and the real one showed up this time. However, they said there was nothing they could do since the dude never actually got into the house. We were dumbfounded. One of my housemates called their mum about it, and she blew her lid. She found the local PD's number and rang them up, giving them absolute hell and threatening to drive down there herself to resolve the situation if need be. Apparently, the intervention of an angry woman was just what the cops needed to do something about the situation. Turned out the neighbor was awaiting a trial date due to drug charges, and they decided to take him away for the waiting period. So yeah, creepy angry neighbor. Let's not meet. The following year, housemate 2 and I are living in a different place, and one night at like 2 AM, we get a series of angry bashes on our door, and we have a moment of horrific flashbacks of creepy neighbor, and I go and grab old trusty hammer and check the door. Apparently, that time it was some drunk students being pricks, but oh, did it rattle us. My friend Sally had a bad run with neighbors, but this was one of the worst. Sally lives very close to me, about a 10-minute walk. We were both around 14 years old when this happened. We live rural, so we both have a lot of land. Me and Sally decided to go camping on her land. We bought cheap hammocks and went through the bushland. The days prior, we spent clearing some of the razor grass with a cane knife to make a path. We probably should have worn long pants because we ended up with little cuts all over our legs and some on our arms. We set up our hammocks and brought quite a few blankets because it does get pretty cold at night, even though you're sweating throughout the day. We were still on her property and hadn't gone to her neighbor's boundary. Her neighbor had just leased the land to new tenants. Me and Sally were sitting on our hammocks, talking and laughing, and this was around 9 PM. We heard something in the bush. We just thought it was a wallaby. There's plenty of wallabies around here. Then we could see the figure of a man. We were whispering to each other and trying to see who it was. At first, we thought it was her brother. He had come to scare us when we were camping previously. Then, as the person got closer, we were thinking it could have been her dad. It was dark, and the bush looks the same from every angle. We realized that the man was coming from the other direction than her house. We didn't dare move, and covered our torches under our blankets. The man came up and said hi, introducing himself as Ben. Now, Ben was extremely drunk. He staggered around and reeked of alcohol. He started saying how we had a nice little camp here, and said something pretty unsettling. I'll have to come out and sunbake naked here on one of these hammocks. Me and Sally gave each other worried looks, but didn't say anything. It only got worse from there. I can't remember everything he said, because it was a while ago, and he was mumbling on for what felt like forever, but some of the things that stuck out were, "I'll have to kill you, Wolf Creek style," and said, "You're nearly legal then," when he asked us our age. Ben was probably in his 40s. Me and Sally were texting each other while he was talking and coming up with an escape plan. He also offered us a, quote, puff on the magic dragon and pulled out a glass pipe. We declined. Sally said we were leaving back to the house to make food. He told us to come back. We left our blankets and most of the stuff there and legged it. We told her dad what had happened and we slept inside. The next morning we went back to our campsite to find everything burned. A circle with probably a 20-meter radius was all burnt. Coming from that circle was a line of burnt grass, going towards the neighbor's house. I'm not a firefighter or do forensics, but it seemed obvious that some kind of fuel was used. Me and Sally were talking, and it dawned on us the possibility that Ben may have thought we were in the hammocks due to the pile of blankets. Ben was definitely drunk enough not to be able to tell the difference. We went and told Sally's dad, who then checked it out, and then went next door. Ben's roommate answered the door and said Ben wasn't home and apologized, and even gave Sally's dad $50 for the blankets and hammocks. Nothing happened for a few months. Sally told me at school how Ben had been caught on camera sneaking around her yard. I went to her house after school because she was going to be home alone until her dad finished work. I ended up sleeping over there that night. That's when he came over. Ben was drunk and came out in front of Sally's house and started yelling he accused her of stealing his dog. Sally's dad called the police. They arrested him. The next day, we found a knife in the yard. It wasn't from Sally's house. The police came again and we told them about the knife and they got the footage from the cameras as well. I don't know what happened to Ben, but he no longer lives next to Sally. So Ben, let's never meet again. I consider most of 1996 to be a rebuilding year in my life. I was 25 years old, fresh out of a relationship that crashed and burned right before the wedding. So deep was the crater and widespread fallout that I had moved to a different state to avoid my to-be father-in-law's friends in law enforcement, who were making sure I spent time roadside with them at least 4 times in the first 2 months after it all ended. I started over in a new place with a lack of resources and connections that were going to make it hard to get back into shape before I turned 30. Still, I was free and beholden to no one but my creditors, so I had that going for me. I lived in my means and rented a townhouse in a long row of properties in a less than reputable part of town. I didn't have time to do a walkthrough before I moved in. In fact, I rented the place unseen based on the online ad. It was close to the job, which was great because someone trashed my car the week before I moved out, and I ended up driving a beat-up Dodge pickup that I bought with the last of my savings. Once settled, I was locked into a rental for 12 months, which, oddly enough, gave me a sense of permanence in my new surroundings and helped me get to work on my new life and career in human capital management and training services. My unit was at the end of the block of 12, with 2 bedrooms up top, with a master bath and half a bath in the living area. It was not a massive space, but it felt empty for the lack of any furniture. I slept on an inflatable mattress my first 3 months, and used folding chairs and a card table to eat and watch television. The block was a place where people were either on their way up or back down. Young kids in their first home, recently divorced with kids, the downturn from society in one way or another. There were fights, domestic and otherwise, throughout the night. Drunken parties and birthday galas took over the block on weekends, but nobody ever interacted with other families for some reason. No one knew anyone else's name or business. At least that's what the cops told me the first time they stopped by to ask me if I heard or witnessed something going on in the block. My immediate neighbors were just weird, like a space monkey on your lawn inviting you to anal probe kind of weird. It was a circus of 3. The short, wild-haired woman looked like an off-brand troll doll with pink hair that defied logic and a malfunctioning soundboard that only shrieked when provoked. The tall, thin man looked like an average bold human might appear in an elongated funhouse mirror. I don't know how old they were, but they resembled old, well-worn furniture, like the contents of an elderly couple's storage locker, old and ready to be discarded. The troll lady and funhouse man were not fond of talking to neighbors, or anyone. They were troubled people. Their fights would bleed through the shared walls and get louder when they talked outside. They knocked my only hanging art from the wall when one threw the other against the side. Funhouse man liked to take his morning coffee in the sunshine, standing behind the screen of his front door in tighty whities and an oversized flannel shirt. He was often the first person I'd encounter in the morning on my way to work, and he would stare across the playground into the woods, as if in a trance, long before I left the townhouse, and probably long after my truck took me away. The cops knew them by their real names. There had been a child living there, but he or she had been removed from the home. A frequent guest in their Little David Lynch sitcom world was a guy named Chuck, so named because Troll Lady would yell his name every 10 minutes anytime he was in the house. Chuck was a long-haul truck driver who parked his sleeper rig across the street every couple of weeks. For some reason, he didn't shower inside, so Saturday mornings he would often run the garden hose over the fenced-in area in the back to take a cold shower, which was a lovely sight the first time. I didn't know what was going on. He sometimes walked out back to take a long beer piss in the runoff drain. His aversion to indoor plumbing was never explained to me, but I am forever grateful I never walked out back to catch him popping a squat in the tree line. For about 6 months, I tolerated the noise, let the neighbors be the bad guys, and call the police when the fight went too loud for too long, or when they all got drunk and played their 80s punk records through the night and engaged in the song of their people howling at the moon. I got to the place where I was making enough money to buy real furniture or rent a better place. I still had a lease to honor, so I bought a sofa, a real bed, and a desk set for an office. It was still a minimalist affair, but comfortable. The townhouse felt like my home for once, and suddenly, the intrusions from the neighbors were twice as annoying. One night, Troll Lady got into a fight with a pizza delivery driver who knocked on her door by mistake, but wouldn't give her the pizza. I only know this because the pizza and its box hit my front window at different spots. This shrieking pink-haired witch assaulted the driver, which led to a light show by the police that rivaled the Mannheim Steamroller Christmas show. I was left to clean the pizza off the window and call the office to replace the window. They refused until the neighbors agreed to pay. So I enjoyed a cracked window for a month before the court accepted her guilty plea over the property damage. Her arrest was around the same time residents on our block and the next one over began reporting burglaries, and I was asked by the police if I had any information or experienced anything odd. Other than the 3 geek circus next door, I told them I did not. Fortunately, my work and social life were on the rebound. I met a girl and we hit it off, though we stayed far from my house during the early part of our relationship, so I began spending more time away from my home, though I would often come home late to the neighbors in a loud state of either bliss or rage. During the day, maintenance workers would replace the insulation and update the HVAC system along the attic spaces along the entire block. I didn't think much about it because the work was done while I was gone in the daytime, and I assumed the property managers would be coming into my place at some point to access my attic. Probably the last one, as they started on the far end from mine. Quickly, I lost track of the project. One night I came home and something felt a little off. The front door was locked, the windows intact, and the back door was secured. However, it felt and even smelled a little off. Sometimes I could smell the tobacco and weed upstairs when it filtered up over the attic space, but I was sure someone had been there. I cleared the house in a short, quiet march, as my dad, a Marine, taught me, but found no one and nothing missing. My computer, 2 TVs, everything was intact. Except I went to grab a beer from the fridge to calm my nerves and found a 6-pack missing. I was sure I had 2 scratch batch stout packs from my last visit to Stewie's microbrew. The loaf of bread seemed to be a little shorter than the morning before, by several slices. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I might be missing some other items as well, but wasn't sure if it was just the growing anxiety over being robbed. I wondered if maintenance had been by to inspect the window or work in the attic and help themselves to a snack and drinks. It would explain the musty smell in my apartment, and given the people I knew who owned and managed the property, it would not surprise me if a couple of their day laborers took a load off for a bit. The smell was most present upstairs, but in my office, which was opposite the neighbor's wall, so it wasn't lingering dank. It was clearly Jim Funk. I immediately assumed laborer, because it made the most sense, so I didn't report it to the police that night. The next morning, however, I discovered my medications missing from my cabinet, all of them. My Lexapro, my emergency anxiety meds, and my other bottles were gone. I checked the windows and doors again, now in a near panic. I called off work for the first time using a burglary as my excuse. I was the 7th house in 2 townhouse blocks to be hit in the past 2 weeks, the 5th in my block, and one of the 5 without signs of forced entry. The police wouldn't tell me much about the other incidents and didn't seem to believe that I locked my doors until I reminded them who I lived next to. By that point, I really didn't want to live in that place anymore. It no longer felt like home. I was sharing it with something I felt lingering in the air around me. There was a feeling of dread, a sense of violation knowing there was someone out there who was inside your life without permission. Once removed, it feels like living in a house without walls. And there was a serial burglar in a neighborhood where the cops traditionally left to work out its own problems and carry away the remains. A week after the break-in, a few things happened to mess up my world even further. First, Troll Lady returned home. Because she was on house arrest, a welcome party brought out all the freaks Friday night. Second, because I was a dumbass, I had come home and picked up a few things I needed to spend the weekend with my girlfriend. As she was already in the truck, and we were to be on the highway out of town, there was no other choice but to bring her back home with me. The lot, including my spaces, was filled with what looked like gridlock in a demolition derby, so I had to park a good distance away. Third, she insisted on seeing the inside of my townhouse and take a pee before hitting the road, so I had to introduce her to the freak show next door before even setting foot inside. Fourth, on the way up the walk to the front door, we encountered Funhouse Man in the open doorway, gatekeeper to the drunk dumbassery inside. He was wearing his morning apparel, briefs and a long shirt, except with a can of Red Dog instead of a coffee in his hand. Fifth, Funhouse Man looked at us coming up the walk and spoke to me for the first time in 7 months. "You tap that," I think he said, his wet mouth spitting the words and his dead eyes scoping my girl. I shifted to put myself between them on the walk as we closed in on the door and fished my keys out of my pants. Funhouse Man panicked, letting out a squeal before diving inside and slamming the door. The party went silent instantly. Sixth, my girl was unnerved by this and lost all her thrill over being with me in that place. She walked inside my home and registered her immediate disapproval. She didn't even want to pee there. I remember making some excuses, saying it's a temporary thing and the first step to better living, etc. But it was the beginning of the end for us, like she caught me cheating with Troll Lady. Seventh, I didn't realize the party had spilled out onto the front lawn and in front of my townhouse until I opened the door to see Chuck, the trucker, standing under my porch lamp looking drunk, stupid and angry. He was joined by a few strangers who looked equal parts the same condition, and also like I had just fired the lot of them from the sideshow. I stopped inside the screen door trying to think of anything to say, clever or otherwise. Chuck the trucker started the conversation. "You go at Kenny?" "What?" "Shit for brains. I ask if you went after Kenny in his own home." Nothing like that happened, but I knew immediately that my reality was not shared by those gathered in front of my own home. "No, he said something. I got closer to hear. He squealed like a little girl and ran inside. End of story." I was okay at the end of the first 2 sentences, but my anger got the best of me by the start of the third, and it did little to calm the group, which had swollen to about a dozen people looking for blood or things to break. Chuck was not convinced by my answer and took a step forward to open my screen door. He put a hand on the knob and stopped. "You step out here, or I come in there." "Go and shit in a tree, asshole. You're not coming in here, and I'm not bleeding over that weirdo friend of yours. You can go beat each other like you normally." 8th. The words stopped there because Chuck had punched a hole in my screen to get to my face. I fell back and accidentally tackled my now firmly ex-girlfriend. Fortunately, I didn't have much in the way of furniture to break on the way down. The only thing going for me at that moment was the miraculous arrival of the police, drawn by the parking fiasco and the noise. My face was broken. My newest ex had a bloody nose and a sprained shoulder, and I was out a good $400 in deposits for a weekend that would never happen. In short order, a few important things happened. Chuck went to jail, and the charges against him would become the least of his problems. The party turned into story time, where partygoers spun their best yarn about how I insulted, assaulted, beat, or messed with Kenny, the funhouse man. I was questioned about the encounter by police and spent time with an EMT, who I totally failed to impress enough to get her number. I was let go as several of the partygoers were arrested for either public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, or outstanding warrants. I'm sure this warmed me to the neighbors and their friends. My weekend companion was rescued from it all by a friend who drove her out of my life forever. You would think 8 things in short order would be enough. I had to continue living next to these screw-ups for at least 4 more months, and I was going to spend those months terrified by what they might do to my property while I was working, or the burglars coming back. However, 9th, I woke the next morning to the neighbors cleaning up from the party. Glass and aluminium, plastic and cardboard packed 2 full-sized bins. Credit where it's due, they recycled. From my what the hell position in my bedroom window, I noticed 2 of the bottles stood out from the Keystone, Red Dog, and Milwaukee labels. They were the scratch batch labels from my 6-pack. Now, there was a chance that they were brought to the party by a guest with better taste in beer than friends, but that was too much of a coincidence. My brain presented a question I could not answer. Where is this attic access in this townhouse? I just assumed there was one somewhere, but never actually looked or came across it. So how did maintenance get into it? While totally unrelated to the beer bottle on a conscious level, my paranoia and cynical nature collaborated on a series of connections. As I looked around the house for a drop that I had missed for months, my brain worked in its weird way to line up facts in such a way that would sound insane if I wrote it all out. I went upstairs. My office was where the funk smell had been most pungent. I looked around again and decided to check the closet. I didn't check it before because there was nothing in it. On the carpet, I noticed a light dusting of drywall and paint flecks. I assumed it was rubbing from the sliding door against the wall, but it concentrated at the side by the wall and not equally along the track. The closet only had hanging shelves on the interior side. Looking up, I expected to see an attic access port, but found a jagged square carved into the drywall ceiling. Maintenance was not exactly flip this shack quality, but I didn't think even they would use a box cutter to carve a hole in my ceiling, and none of them were skinny enough to fit through that. Funhouse Man was skinny enough to potentially weasel up and down. The scuff mark on the inside wall of the closet was pretty telling. It took a while for the police to make their way over in response to my non-emergency call, but it quickly gathered their interest when the first responding officer reported what everyone missed the first time they did a half-assed search of my home. 3 unmarked cars arrived after the initial squad car. My neighbors were uncharacteristically quiet once the first cruiser rolled up around noon. I offered a folding ladder, and the police looked up into the blisteringly hot attic. A hole had been cut through the insulation, and a spot in the corner wide enough for a small or slender person to fit through. I was questioned again downstairs for about an hour before I heard more voices upstairs than I remember going up there. Before I could ask, a familiar face appeared at my door. My landlord, Ahmed, looked concerned and astonished, which was a new expression, and the third after his "can I take your money" and his general resting "screw off" face. "What has happened?" he asked. "What is going on? Are you alright?" He walked into my home without invitation and up to me on my sofa. I asked him if he was there to fix my cracked window. Everything else happened without my direct involvement. I remained a guest in my own home for most of the day as police took photos and marched up and down my stairs. I learned that my assumption about the attic work was wrong, that workers had access to specific units to get around the firewalls between them. In fact, there were holes in the firewall that allowed workers to enter the roof in one unit and run the entire length of the building. It was a measure that saved time and footsteps, but was a violation of several laws and codes, meaning that Ahmed's life was about to become much more complicated and expensive. These gaps in the firewalls also allowed someone to drill a hole in their own ceiling and run the length of the 11 other homes, walking on the same boards laid by the property owners that muffled their presence. Every single unit in that block had a hole similar to the one in my ceiling. Further, at one time, the building had been wired for cable through the roof, and holes that had been cut to fish cable into the upstairs bedrooms had been plugged up years earlier during an upgrade. Some of those patches had been replaced with removable plugs, giving someone clear view into various bedrooms. In the attic, police found a step stool with a rope tied to the top step. It was stashed in the corner of the roof over my next-door neighbor's unit. But that's not the weirdest thing. Though all evidence pointed to the main access point being the smaller bedroom in my neighbor's unit, police did not arrest Funhouse Man or Troll Doll Lady for the crime. Around 3 in the afternoon, police had recovered items stolen from other units along with various controlled substances. Troll Doll Lady was arrested for violating the terms of her bond. Funhouse Man was taken in for the drugs. I was shocked to see a third person, not Chuck, walk out of the townhouse in cuffs. I'd never met him before. He was rail thin, thinner than Funhouse Man by half. An old man's face in a young man's body, with scars and bruises all over skin that I've only ever seen on corpses, white and waxy. He was naked, except for soiled basketball shorts. He literally recoiled as if allergic to outside air and sun, and had to be dragged, shoeless, to the cruiser. I don't know who that kid was, but I got the feeling he never left the townhouse, ever. maybe not even the attic. The thought that this skeletal creep was looking in on me and had access to my life makes me overly cautious these days. I have eyes everywhere in my home, and I take pains to inspect the smallest spaces in and around my property. I often wake in the night seeing that face peering at me through a window or from the dark. It's been a long time, and everyone I mentioned in this story by name is dead. I don't know about the kid though. I never got a name, and I was unable to find him in any police record. Maybe he doesn't really exist. Maybe he didn't show up on any records and is languishing in prison as John Doe. Or maybe he's out there, lurking in some upper level of an apartment building, or hiding inside the basement or walls. I've rarely ever felt truly home since.